In the opulent office at the top of a skyscraper bearing his name, Cornelius sat amidst windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Normally focused on business, today his mind was consumed by a troubling issue. His son, Hugo, had become a bigger problem than he ever anticipated. "Mr. Cornelius, your son is here," announced his assistant, Elise, her voice reflecting the high tension between father and son. "Send him in," Cornelius responded, his tone cold and resolute. Hugo entered with his characteristic nonchalant air, dressed in lavish attire, sunglasses barely concealing the dark circles from the previous night's revelry. He slumped onto the leather sofa without formality. "So, Dad, what's today's lecture? Another lesson on responsibility?" Hugo's voice was laced with sarcastic disdain. Cornelius didn't immediately reply. He observed his son, trying to fathom how someone with so much potential had turned into such an irresponsible mess. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Hugo, this isn't a game anymore," Cornelius said, his voice grave and serious. "You've crossed too many lines. Your life has become a complete disaster, and I can't let this continue." Hugo laughed briefly. "Oh, please, Dad. You say this all the time. If you're so unhappy, just cut off my money for a few days. But we both know you always come back." This time, Cornelius wasn't swayed by Hugo's insolence. He stood slowly from his chair and walked to the window, gazing at the city he had built with so much effort. "This isn't about money anymore, Hugo. You're going to learn a life lesson, and it starts now," he declared, turning back to face his son. "You're going to get married." A heavy silence fell over the room. "Married? What?" Hugo finally paid attention, removing his sunglasses. Cornelius remained unfazed. "I've arranged everything. You're going to marry Maria, a humble farmer who lives in the countryside. This will be your new beginning." Hugo was momentarily frozen, processing what he'd just heard. When the reality sank in, he leaped to his feet in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me, right? This is some kind of sick joke." Cornelius stood firm. "You either accept this or you lose everything. Your life of parties, excess, and luxury, it will all end. The choice is yours." Hugo's face turned red with rage. "You can't force me into this. I won't do it. I won't repeat myself, Hugo. You either marry Maria and learn the value of hard work and responsibility, or you'll leave this building with nothing but the clothes on your back. No second chances." Hugo stared at his father, unsure if this was real. The idea of marrying a stranger and living in the countryside was ludicrous for someone like him. But Cornelius' unyielding gaze made it clear this was his final chance. "I'll think about it," Hugo muttered, trying to buy time. "There's nothing to think about," Cornelius replied coldly. "You have a few days to pack your things. After that, you'll move to the farm where you'll live with Maria. From today, your life of parties and privileges is over." Hugo left the building with quick, angry steps, his mind turbulent. How could Cornelius even consider this madness? He, the heir to the Cornelius fortune, marrying a simple farmer. The bustling streets of the city blurred as he walked, his heart pounding with indignation. This was not the future he had envisioned. Back at his luxury apartment, Hugo slammed the door, his trembling hands clenched into fists as he processed their conversation. The silence of his place starkly contrasted with the internal turmoil consuming him. Without thinking, he headed to the bar and poured himself a double whiskey. The drink burned down his throat but didn't ease his frustration. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming the glass down. "He can't do this to me." His phone vibrated, a message from a high society friend asking about plans for another party that night. Hugo stared at the message, feeling a mix of anger and despair. The idea of continuing his excessive lifestyle now seemed so distant. Determined not to yield easily, Hugo called his personal lawyer, Stefano Barone, one of the city's best, known for finding legal loopholes. "Stefano, I need your help. My father is forcing me into an absurd situation, and I want to know if there's anything we can do legally to stop this." "Of course, Hugo. What exactly is it about?" Stefano's voice was calm and professional. "He's trying to make me marry a woman from the countryside, someone I've never met. He's threatening to disinherit me if I don't comply." There was a brief sigh from Stefano before he replied, "That's unusual, but technically, if your father controls the estate and company shares, he can indeed cut you off from the family assets." Hugo felt the ground disappear beneath him. "So there's nothing we can do?" "Unfortunately, not in the short term. He has full control. My recommendation is to accept for now, and later, with time, we can try another strategy." "This is unacceptable." Hugo fumed, throwing his phone onto the couch. The weight of reality hit him hard. He was trapped. In the following days, Hugo tried to ignore the impending change by throwing himself into parties, meeting friends, and indulging in distractions. But the shadow of his decision loomed large, and no amount of indulgence could push it away. Each time he picked up his phone, he thought about calling Cornelius to refuse, but he knew his father was immovable. One evening, looking out from his luxurious apartment as the city lights turned on, a bitter sense of helplessness washed over him. He knew his privileged life was about to change, and despite his denials, there was nowhere left to run. On the day of departure, Hugo dragged himself to the Cornelius family mansion for a final meeting with his father before heading to Maria's farm. Cornelius sat in his imposing leather chair, his expression unyielding as stone. "So, you've decided to accept?" Cornelius asked bluntly, watching his son with calculating eyes. Hugo let out a heavy, tired sigh. "Seems like I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Cornelius remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "You do have a choice. You can choose to accept this, to become the man you need to be, or lose everything. You know that's your choice. This is blackmail." Hugo exploded, his voice echoing through the office. "You're using your fortune to control me, this isn't fair." Calmly, Cornelius stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "It's not about control, Hugo. It's about responsibility. You've lived your whole life without facing the consequences of your actions. Now it's time for that to change." Hugo stepped forward, fists clenched. "And why should I believe this will make me a better person, living in the middle of nowhere with a woman I don't even know?" "Because this is your last chance." Cornelius turned to face his son, his eyes filled with calculated coldness. "You're going to learn what it means to truly live, away from privilege. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll find something you never expected, purpose." Hugo stood silent, his father's words hitting him like a punch. He didn't want to admit it, but a small part of him was beginning to question his choices. Still, his pride kept him resentful. It wouldn't be easy to change. "I'll go, but only because you've given me no other option," Hugo said, his voice bitter. Cornelius nodded, showing no emotion. "Tomorrow, you'll leave for Maria's farm, and there your new life will begin." Hugo left the office with a heavy heart, knowing the road ahead would be full of challenges. But he was determined not to let his father win so easily. The next morning, Hugo was somewhat ready, or at least he tried to convince himself of that. His bags were packed in the back of his car as he drove away from the city. The journey transitioned from wide avenues to winding rural roads surrounded by vast fields and rolling hills. Each mile took him further from his world of luxury, weighing heavily on his shoulders. His thoughts tormented him. he still couldn't believe this was happening, marrying a stranger, living on a farm. His anger towards his father was deep, but fear was growing in his chest, fear of the unknown, of becoming someone different from who he had always been. After hours of driving, he reached a small village. The houses were simple with clay-tiled roofs, the people distant from the frenetic pace Hugo was used to. Everything about the place bothered him, the silence, the fresh air, the tranquility that seemed to mock his internal turmoil. Finally, the GPS led him to the farm. Maria's property was modest, with a small farmhouse surrounded by well-tended flowers and a vegetable garden in the back. Hugo stopped the car, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a few minutes, a knot forming in his stomach. He took a deep breath, stepped out, and approached the house with his luggage, his expression visibly displeased. The door opened slowly, and Maria appeared. She was a young woman of simple appearance but with a confident posture. She wore a light fabric dress and work boots, her hands slightly dirted with soil. Unlike what Hugo had imagined, she wasn't intimidated by the situation, there was a calmness in her brown eyes that immediately unsettled him. "You must be Hugo," Maria said, her voice firm and clear, devoid of any exaggerated emotion. "Welcome." Hugo, however, didn't hide his irritation. "So this is where I'm going to live now? It's smaller than I expected." Maria kept her serene expression. "It's simple but functional, enough for those who know how to work and appreciate what they have." There was a slight tone of reproach in her words, but she said it so gently that Hugo wasn't sure if it was intentional or not. He scoffed, clearly uninterested in courtesy. "And where exactly do I stay?" Hugo asked, his tone sharp. Maria gestured towards the open door. "I'll show you the house." She turned and walked without waiting for him to follow. Reluctantly, Hugo grabbed his bags and entered. The interior was simple but clean and organized. The furniture was rustic wood, and the walls were adorned with family photographs, contrasting sharply with the impersonal, minimalist life Hugo knew in his luxury apartments. There was a sense of history and belonging here that made him feel even more out of place. Maria stopped at the door of a room and pointed. "This will be your room. It's not large, but it's enough. The bathroom is at the end of the hall." Hugo dropped his bags on the floor, looking around with a frown. "This feels like a prison." "It's what we have," Maria replied unfazed. "If you want to improve something, you'll have to do it yourself." Hugo turned to her abruptly, his frustrations boiling over. "Listen, I didn't choose to be here. I'm here because I was forced, so don't expect me to adapt easily. I'm a Cornelius, this isn't who I am." Maria crossed her arms, her expression unshaken. "And I didn't ask for you to be here, Hugo. If it were up to me, you wouldn't be. But the reality is we're in this situation together, and like you, I'm making sacrifices too." Hugo was silent for a moment, surprised by her firmness. He had expected someone submissive, someone to accept his father's demands without question. But Maria wasn't like that, she had a strength that threw him off balance. "Sacrifices," he repeated with disdain. "You seem to be handling all of this pretty well." "I handle what's necessary," Maria replied, her voice steady. "This farm is my life. I work every day to keep it going. I don't have the luxury of wasting time complaining. And now you're a part of it, whether you like it or not." Hugo felt his pride take a hit. No one had ever confronted him like this, especially not someone he considered beneath him socially. But for some reason, he couldn't find a response, he just stood there, staring at her, unsure of what to say. Maria, noticing Hugo's hesitation, broke the silence. "We're going to live together from now on, but that doesn't mean we have to like each other. What we need is mutual respect, and for now, that's a good start." Without waiting for a response, Maria turned and left the room, leaving Hugo alone with his thoughts. The full weight of the situation finally hit him. He was trapped here in this house with a woman he barely knew, who seemed as strong as the father who had put him in this position. As he looked at his bags on the floor in the simple room that would now be his home, Hugo realized that his worst nightmare was just beginning. When the day of the wedding arrived, Hugo woke up in that same modest room, the physical discomfort mirroring the inner turmoil he felt. The wedding felt like a farce, a forced event with no emotional meaning to him. It was just another controlling move by his father, and now reality was knocking at his door. Outside, the small village chapel was the opposite of what Hugo had imagined for such an event in his life. He was used to luxurious parties with glamour and high-profile guests, but the scene before him was simple and understated. A small stone building with a bell tower and a modest flower garden around it. Only a few people were present, mostly Maria's neighbors invited to the ceremony. The difference between this setting and the grand events of high society was a cruel reminder of where Hugo had been thrown. Dressed in an elegant suit, the only luxury item he had left, Hugo felt out of place. Everyone around him seemed calm, as if the simplicity of rural life was enough to meet their expectations. But for him, this was a symbol of his defeat, the result of his irresponsible choices and his father's relentless interference. Maria appeared at the chapel's entrance in a simple white dress without any of the extravagant embellishments Hugo was accustomed to. However, she walked with a straight posture, a serenity that radiated strength and determination. There were no signs of joy or expectation on her face. She knew this marriage wasn't born out of love or choice but imposed by circumstances. Even so, her eyes conveyed a dignity that deeply unsettled. Hugo. So, here we are, Hugo muttered as Maria approached, his tone a mix of resignation and suppressed anger. Do you think this is fair? Maria looked at him with calm eyes, unflinching. Fair or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is how we deal with it. Hugo scoffed, shaking his head. You talk as if this is just a simple change of routine. Because that's how I see it, Maria replied with a frankness that threw him off. We're both stuck in this situation, and the more we resist, the harder it will be. Those words echoed in Hugo's mind, but he was far from accepting them. To him, this marriage was a humiliation, an affront to the life he knew and the pride he had always carried. Inside the small chapel, the priest began the ceremony, his calming voice filling the room as he recited the rites. Hugo looked around, feeling like a stranger amidst such simplicity. There were no guests on his side, not his mother nor old friends from high society, only Maria's neighbors, people he barely knew who didn't seem to care about the grandeur he was accustomed to. When it was Hugo's turn to say his vows, he hesitated, the silence in the chapel becoming heavy, all eyes on him. The weight of the moment bore down on him. To him, the words were empty, devoid of any meaning. Yet, something in Maria's steady gaze compelled him to continue. Yes, I do, he murmured, barely able to hide the bitterness in his voice. The priest turned to Maria, who responded with her usual firmness. Yes, I do. With those words, both their fates were sealed, but unlike traditional weddings where the moment is filled with celebration and hopes for the future, the silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. There were no smiles, no hugs, just an imposed commitment neither truly wanted. After the ceremony, Hugo walked out of the chapel, taking a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He felt suffocated by the weight of the situation, the resentment in his chest growing. He watched as Maria spoke with some neighbors, thanking them for coming. Her calm and confident demeanor irritated him. How could she be so composed? You seem uncomfortable, said a voice behind him. It was Don Matteo, one of Maria's neighbors invited to the wedding, an older man with a kind but perceptive look. Hugo turned to him with a forced smile. This is all new to me. I understand, Don Mateo said, watching him closely. But sometimes life puts us in situations we don't expect, and the only thing we can do is find a way to move forward. Hugo didn't respond, simply nodding politely. Those words, though well-intentioned, didn't resonate with him. This wasn't just an unexpected situation, it was a complete unraveling of everything he believed he was. He didn't belong here, in this place or this life, and certainly not in this marriage. As night fell and all the guests had left, Hugo and Maria returned to the farmhouse. The silence between them was palpable. Maria didn't seem bothered by the tension, but for Hugo, every second dragged on like an eternity. He locked himself in his new room, threw himself onto the bed, and stared at the ceiling, feeling more trapped than ever. The night was long and restless for him. For the first time, Hugo found himself in a situation he didn't know how to escape from. He felt defeated, a prisoner of a life he would never have chosen. As he tried to sleep, the quiet of the farm was broken only by the distant sounds of animals and the wind in the trees. It was a different kind of silence, one that seemed to amplify his own thoughts, making everything more unbearable. He knew that from this moment on, his life had been irrevocably changed, and the worst part was he had no idea how to deal with it. The next morning, Hugo was abruptly woken by the sound of clucking chickens and the frantic movement of people outside. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling the weight of his body in the discomfort of a simple bed he wasn't used to. For a moment, he wished it was all just a nightmare, that when he opened his eyes, he would be back in his luxury apartment. But as he stood up and looked around the modest room, he realized reality was unforgiving. Maria was already up, working on the farm since early morning. For her, it was just another ordinary day, but for Hugo, it was the beginning of a life he would never have chosen. He dragged himself to the kitchen where Maria was finishing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air, but Hugo wasn't in the mood to enjoy anything. "Good morning," Maria said without looking up from the bread she was placing on the table, her voice calm but without the enthusiasm that usually accompanies a greeting. "If you can call it a good morning," Hugo grumbled, rubbing his face as he sat down at the table. He looked around the simple room, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with every detail. "So, what exactly am I supposed to do here?" he asked. Maria raised her eyes to him, a glint of patience in her gaze. "You can start by helping with the simpler tasks. There's a lot of work to do on the farm, and everyone has to contribute." Hugo rolled his eyes. "Contribute? This feels like punishment, not life." Maria took a deep breath, holding on to her patience. "No one's asking you to like it, but if you want to be part of this, you need to learn to work like everyone else. There won't be anyone here to serve you breakfast in bed or clean up after you." Hugo sensed the provocation in her words but was too tired to engage in another verbal spar. Instead, he grabbed a slice of bread and took a distracted bite without really tasting it. The silence that settled between them was tense, loaded with unspoken expectations. After finishing breakfast, Maria stood up and went to the door, picking up a hoe leaning against the wall. "You can start by helping fix the fences around the pasture. They need to be reinforced to make sure the cattle don't get out." Hugo looked at her in disbelief. "Me, fix fences? Are you serious?" "I am," Maria replied with her usual calm. "Here, everyone does their part. It doesn't matter if you're the son of a rich businessman or if you've never worked with your hands before. If you don't help, the farm doesn't run." Hugo's resentment only grew. He, accustomed to luxury, was now expected to fix fences and work in the fields. It seemed unthinkable, but at the same time, he knew that while he was here, he had no other choice. He got up from the table with a heavy sigh and followed Maria to the barn, where she handed him the tools he would need for the job. "Start over there," she said, pointing to one of the fences surrounding the pasture. "If you have any questions, ask." Hugo took the tool with a grimace, feeling the weight of the wood and metal in his hands. He had never touched anything like this in his life. For him, this kind of work was for others, people he barely noticed on the streets, and now here he was, forced to get his hands dirty. Reluctantly, he began working. His hands, used to holding wine glasses or the steering wheel of sports cars, quickly started to ache from the effort. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to adjust the boards of the fence without much success. He cursed under his breath as the day grew hotter, making everything even more exhausting. Maria, working in the nearby field, watched him from a distance. She knew this was hard for Hugo, that he had no preparation for a life of physical labor, but at the same time, she knew this was the only way for him to begin to understand what it meant to live outside his bubble of privilege. "Everything okay over there?" she finally asked, walking over. Hugo wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at her with frustration. "No, nothing's okay. This is insane. I have no idea what I'm doing." Maria nodded, understanding. "I know it's hard, but no one is born knowing. You'll get used to it in time, and if you need help, just ask." "I didn't ask to be here," he replied irritably, looking at the tool in his hands like it was some alien object. "This is humiliating." Maria looked at him firmly but without anger. "I know you didn't ask for this, Hugo. Neither did I, but we're here, and we have to deal with it." Silence stretched between them as Hugo processed Maria's words. He couldn't understand how she could be so calm, so serene in a situation that to him felt unbearable. But for some reason, he also couldn't muster the energy to keep complaining. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe the growing realization that his resistance wasn't getting him anywhere. "Show me how to fix this," he finally said, his tone softer, almost resigned. Maria nodded, taking the tool from Hugo's hands and beginning to show him the basics of how to adjust the boards and reinforce the structure. Hugo watched silently, trying to learn, though his mind was still full of doubts and resentment. It was a small step, but somehow an important one. For the first time since arriving at the farm, he was willing to try. The day passed slowly, and Hugo continued working, albeit awkwardly and reluctantly. With each board he adjusted, with each nail he hammered, he felt his pride wear down a little more. But at the same time, something inside him was starting to change. Maybe it was the direct contact with manual labor, something so distant from his reality until now, or perhaps it was Maria's constant presence, whose calm seemed impenetrable. At the end of the day, his hands were calloused and sore, his body exhausted, but for the first time, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from successful business deals or material achievements, it was something different, something he didn't yet know how to define. When he returned home, Maria was already preparing dinner. They ate in silence as always, but the silence between them felt less tense now, more familiar. Hugo didn't know what the future held for him, but at that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something in this new life worth discovering. Tell me what you think of the story so far. Leave a like and comment on what impacted you the most and where you're watching from. The days passed slowly for Hugo, each one bringing new challenges and confrontations with a life he had never imagined for himself. Every morning, the silence of the farm would wake him much earlier than he was used to, the bird song, the sound of working tools, and the smell of freshly tilled soil so far removed from his old reality that at times he felt like he was living in a dream or, worse, a nightmare. Despite his initial disdain, something inside him began to change. Each day of forced labor on the farm brought physical discomfort but also an unexpected sense of accomplishment. Maria, always firm and serene, maintained a constant presence by his side. She never pressured him but also never treated him with condescension. There was a dignity in her silence, and it unsettled him. 1. Afternoon, while Hugo was alone in the stable repairing another broken fence, he watched Maria working in the field, harvesting vegetables under the scorching sun. Her movements were precise and firm, showing no signs of fatigue or complaint. She seemed at peace, as if she were completely in tune with the hard work that life demanded. Hugo, on the other hand, still felt out of place. His calloused hands and exhausted body were evidence that he didn't belong there, and yet he began to question himself. There was something about this simple life that he had never experienced before, a sense of purpose, even if he was still resisting accepting it fully. That night, the discomfort he felt was more internal than physical. As he prepared for dinner, Hugo looked at himself in the small bathroom mirror. His once immaculate clothes were now dirty and worn, his beard unshaven, and his eyes, once full of arrogance, now reflected an unease he couldn't explain. When he joined Maria at the table, the silence between them felt deeper than usual. Hugo finally broke the silence, his voice filled with frustration. "You seem content with this life, as if you have no other choice, but at the same time, as if you don't want anything else. How can you live like this?" Maria looked up from her plate, considering his words before responding. "I guess I've never thought of it as a matter of choice, Hugo. It's not about what I want or don't want, it's about what needs to be done. The farm depends on me, just like it depends on you now." Hugo let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "But don't you ever feel trapped? Don't you want to leave, do something different, see the world?" Maria gave a slight smile, a serene and understanding one. "Maybe in the past I had those desires, but over time, I've learned that there's beauty in finding purpose where we are. The people here work hard every day, and it's not always easy, but there's satisfaction in knowing that what we do has value, even if it's something simple." Hugo leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. He knew he didn't yet fully understand what Maria felt, but something about what she said was starting to make sense to him. For the first time, he began to question his own priorities. Until now, his life had been built around excess, parties, and an endless pursuit of temporary pleasures, but now he wondered if any of that had truly made him happy. "What do you think I should do then?" Hugo asked, his voice softer than usual. Maria looked at him for a moment before answering sincerely, "I don't think I'm the one to tell you what to do, Hugo, but maybe you could start by seeing this situation not as a punishment but as an opportunity. Not everyone gets the chance to reconnect with what really matters." Hugo remained silent, Maria's words echoing in his mind. He had never considered there might be value in a life that seemed to him like a step backward, but somehow her words began to plant seeds of doubt in his heart. Was there something more to this simple life that he was overlooking? The following days brought small moments of reflection for Hugo. He started to observe more closely Maria's routine and that of the other farm workers. It was a life of sacrifices, yes, but also one of small victories. Every task completed, every harvest made, seemed to bring a satisfaction he had never experienced before. Something was changing inside him, even if he didn't want to fully admit it. One morning, while working in the stable, one of the older workers, Don Giovanni, approached him. "I see you're doing better, Hugo. I think the country life is starting to shape you." Hugo smiled, though still somewhat shyly. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to admit it, but yeah, maybe I'm learning something." Don Giovanni gave him a light pat on the back. "It takes time, but we all find our place. What matters is what you do with what you're learning." Hugo nodded, thoughtful. What he was learning here had nothing to do with business, numbers, or profit. It was something deeper, something he was still trying to understand. That afternoon, while working alongside Maria in the field, something curious happened. For the first time, he realized he wasn't thinking about his old life, the city, the luxury, the parties, all seemed distant, like an echo from a life that no longer belonged to him. The farm, with all its simplicity, was beginning to feel familiar. Do you think it's possible to change completely? Hugo asked suddenly, looking at Maria as she harvested the last vegetables of the day. Maria looked at him, surprised by the question. I believe so, if the person is willing to change. But change doesn't happen overnight, it takes time and has to be genuine. Hugo fell silent, pondering her words. Maybe he was starting to change without even realizing it. Maybe this simple life, which he had so despised, was beginning to show him something he had never imagined finding: peace. Time seemed to pass differently on the farm. The frenetic pace of urban life that Hugo once knew was far away, and the quiet of the countryside filled the space with a nearly unsettling tranquility. Each day, the physical labor began to feel a little less unbearable, and Maria's presence, though always calm and reserved, became something he was getting used to. It was as if little by little, Hugo's internal resistance was fading without him even noticing. That morning, Hugo woke to the familiar sound of roosters announcing the start of another day. His body still ached from the previous day's work, but there was something different about how he faced this reality. The physical discomfort, once unbearable, now seemed just another part of the routine, and he started accepting it without so many complaints. After getting dressed, he went to the kitchen where he found Maria preparing breakfast as usual. Good morning, he said, a bit lighter than usual. Good morning, Maria replied with a slight smile, surprised by Hugo's friendlier tone. Today will be a long day. We need to finish fixing the fence around the pasture and harvest the last vegetables before the sun gets too hot. Hugo nodded, grabbing a cup of coffee. He was slowly getting used to the idea that each day on the farm brought a new list of tasks that needed to be done, and while he still didn't enjoy the work, he was starting to see it as a form of order, something he could rely on. They began working together in the field right after breakfast, and for the first time since his arrival, Hugo didn't feel completely out of place. He was still slow and clumsy with some tasks, but now he asked Maria when he had questions instead of struggling alone with tools or work he didn't understand. At one point during the day, while fixing the fence next to Maria, Hugo let out a deep sigh and looked around. The field stretched as far as his eyes could see, the rolling hills seeming endless. The landscape, which had once made him uncomfortable, now seemed to calm him in some way. You seem more at ease today, Maria commented as she adjusted a loose board on the fence. Hugo gave a small smile, still unsure of what he was feeling. Maybe I am. I think I'm starting to understand or at least accept it. It's a start, Maria replied, giving him an encouraging look. The silence that followed between them was different from the awkward silence they had shared before. Now there was a sense of mutual understanding, even if unspoken. Maria had always known that Hugo resisted the work and the new reality, but she also noticed that he was making efforts, small steps toward acceptance, and that in itself was progress. That afternoon, as Hugo walked through the fields after finishing his work, he was surprised by one of the farm workers, Don Pietro, an older man but with admirable energy. Pietro had always been cordial but rarely struck up a conversation with Hugo, aware of the distant attitude he maintained. Tell me, young Cornelius, Don Pietro began, walking beside Hugo. What do you think of all this? Are you starting to find your place here? Hugo looked out toward the horizon, not answering right away. I'm not sure yet. I never thought I'd stay here this long. Pietro let out a light chuckle. Ah, life is funny sometimes. We're taken to places we never imagined, and it's there that we find parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed. Hugo remained silent, reflecting on those words. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew something inside him was changing. The pride and resistance were still there, but each time he worked alongside Maria or the farm workers, something new stirred within him, a sense of humility, perhaps, or the realization that life might be more than what he had imagined until now. Have you ever thought about leaving here, Pietro? Hugo asked, suddenly feeling genuine curiosity about the life of this man who seemed so at ease on the farm. Pietro shook his head with a serene smile. "Oh, I've seen many things, Hugo. I've been to the city, met important people, but none of that ever brought me the peace I've found here. The work is hard, but there's a simplicity to it, a truth. When you put your hands in the soil, you understand that there are things in life that can't be bought." Hugo listened to those words, and for a moment, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a complete revelation, but perhaps a glimmer of light. He couldn't imagine finding peace in something so simple, but he was beginning to understand what Pietro meant. For the first time, the idea of staying on the farm didn't seem so absurd. At the end of the day, as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Hugo sat on the porch of the house, watching the landscape. Maria was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner, and he could hear the clatter of pots and plates in the background. Next to him, Don Giovanni appeared again, like a silent but attentive father figure. "So, Hugo," he said, sitting down beside the young man. "Are you starting to see something different here?" Hugo let out a short but sincere laugh. "Maybe. I still don't know if this life is for me, but I'm starting to see things differently." Don Giovanni nodded as if he already knew that. "It takes time, boy. Change doesn't happen overnight, but you've taken the first step. Now you just have to keep moving forward." Hugo remained silent, reflecting on the old man's words. Perhaps he was changing after all, or at least he was beginning to accept that his old life wasn't coming back anytime soon, and that didn't have to be the end of the world. As he entered the house for dinner, Hugo realized that for the first time since he arrived, he felt a slight sense of relief. The weight he had been carrying on his shoulders, caused by resentment and resistance, was easing, even if slowly. Maria glanced at him sideways, as if she noticed the subtle change but said nothing. The evening passed in silence, but it was a lighter silence without the tension of before. For the first time, Hugo went to bed feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to fall into place, even if he didn't know exactly how. The sun rose gently over the horizon, bathing the fields around the farm in gold and light. The morning rhythm was no longer a surprise to Hugo. He still felt the physical exhaustion, but something in his perspective was shifting, and that change reflected in his willingness to face the days. It was no longer just about surviving in an environment he hadn't chosen. Now there was a growing curiosity inside him, a desire to understand what it really meant to live there. Maria, as always, was busy in the field, working with firmness and determination that Hugo admired, even though he didn't know how to express it. She didn't expect him to change overnight, and it was that quiet acceptance that made him feel more at ease. There was a silent strength in Maria, and more, Hugo noticed that she wasn't just a simple farm woman, there was a complexity to her that he wanted to understand. That morning, as they worked side by side harvesting vegetables, Hugo finally broke the silence that usually hung between them. "Have you always lived here, Maria?" he asked with a tone that showed more interest than he usually displayed. Maria paused for a moment and looked at him, considering the question before answering. "Yes, I grew up here. My parents worked on this farm, and after they were gone, I took on the responsibility of caring for it." Hugo nodded, trying to imagine what it would be like to grow up in a place like this. He had always been surrounded by luxury and opportunities, but Maria didn't seem to resent her life. On the contrary, there was a peace in her words that he didn't yet fully understand. "And you never wanted to leave, see the world?" Hugo asked, his curiosity now genuine. Maria gave a slight smile as she continued her work. "I've thought about it, yes, but life here has its own rewards. I think over time, I realized that what's important to me is here, not out there." Hugo remained silent, reflecting on her response. He had spent so much time searching for meaning outside himself, in parties, excess, in material possessions, that he had never considered the possibility that true purpose might lie in something as simple as daily work and human connections. "You seem at peace with all of this," he said with an admiration he didn't expect to feel. Maria looked at him with her calm brown eyes and replied without hesitation. "I think that's because I found my place." Those words resonated deeply within Hugo. He had spent most of his life feeling lost, even when he had everything money could buy. But here on the farm, Maria had something he had never experienced, a true sense of belonging. As they continued working, the silence between them became less awkward. It was a comfortable silence, as if an invisible connection was beginning to form. For the first time, Hugo felt that he might understand what it meant to find purpose in something simple but meaningful. He didn't know if he could ever reach the same level of peace that Maria had, but he was beginning to see a new possibility for his life. Later that evening, Hugo was sitting on the porch watching the sunset as he rubbed his calloused hands. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and a light breeze blew, carrying the scent of the earth. Maria appeared beside him, sitting quietly, not needing words to fill the space between them. "There's something different here," Hugo said suddenly, his voice soft. "Something I never noticed before." "What do you mean?" Maria asked, tilting her head slightly. Hugo gave a faint smile, still gazing at the horizon. "I think I'm starting to understand what you said about finding your place. For so long, I've been searching for something to make me feel complete, and now I'm starting to wonder if I was looking in the wrong place." Maria was silent for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. "I think life has a strange way of showing us what we need, even when we don't know we're looking for it." Hugo nodded, still reflecting on what she had said. The tranquility he felt around Maria, the simplicity of the life he once despised, was starting to make sense. He still didn't know if he could fully accept his new reality, but it was clear that there was something here he could no longer ignore. "You surprise me, Maria," Hugo confessed, breaking the silence again. "I thought when I came here, I'd find someone submissive, someone who would accept this marriage without question. But you're different." Maria smiled softly, not offended by his words. "Maybe you're used to seeing people in a certain way, but here, life demands strength, and I've learned to find that strength within myself." Hugo looked into her eyes, admiring her honesty in depth. He was used to people who masked their emotions, who played games with appearances and status, but Maria was genuine, and that intrigued him more and more. "You don't have to be something you're not," Maria said, looking directly at him. "I know all of this is hard for you, but maybe if you stop fighting what you can't control, things will get a little easier." Hugo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so much time fighting against the idea of being stuck on the farm, against the forced marriage, and against his father, that he had never considered that maybe it would be easier to simply accept the situation and try to find something of value in it. "Maybe you're right," he said with a sincerity that even surprised himself. Maria smiled, and silence settled between them once again, but this time it was a welcoming silence. Something was changing, not only in the way Hugo saw the farm but also in how he saw Maria. The connection forming between them was subtle but real, and for the first time in a long while, he felt he was beginning to understand what really mattered. Time continued to pass, and with it, Hugo's internal resistance began to fade more and more. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was the beginning of something new, something he had never allowed to flourish before. The work on the farm was still exhausting, but he no longer saw it as punishment. His interactions with Maria grew deeper, and he began to realize that perhaps in this forgotten corner of the world, he was finding something he had always been missing, peace and purpose. However, despite the change he felt, Hugo still carried the weight of his past with him. He knew that as much as he was beginning to feel at home on the farm, the shadow of his old life still haunted him. It was this duality that left him restless, torn between the man he was becoming and the man he had been for so long. It was on a hot afternoon that this internal division came to a breaking point. Hugo was in the field working with Maria when he saw a familiar car approaching in the distance on the dirt road. The glare of the sun made it hard to see at first, but he immediately recognized the luxury model his father Cornelius often drove. Hugo's heart raced, and a sense of discomfort washed over him. Maria noticed the car's arrival as well but said nothing. She simply stopped what she was doing and watched, sensing Hugo's sudden nervousness. "Your father is here," she commented softly, giving him time to process what was about to happen. Hugo nodded, unable to take his eyes off the approaching car. "Yes, he is." The vehicle pulled up at the entrance to the farm, and Cornelius stepped out with his usual imposing presence, dressed in an immaculate suit, looking completely out of place in the rural setting. There was something in Cornelius' expression that made it clear he was here for a confrontation. "Hugo," Cornelius said in a grave tone as he approached. "It seems you've made some progress around here." Hugo swallowed hard, feeling the tension rise in the air. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he replied, trying to remain calm. Cornelius looked around, surveying the farm with a neutral expression. "It's interesting to see you like this. When I sent you here, I didn't think you'd last more than a few weeks, but I see I underestimated your ability to adapt." There was an irony in Cornelius' words that didn't escape Hugo. What his father saw as adaptation, Hugo was beginning to view as transformation. He knew that in Cornelius' eyes, this was still a punishment, but for Hugo, the farm was becoming something more. "I'm not here to argue about what you think," Hugo said, lifting his chin with determination. "I'm here because I have to be, and somehow I think I'm starting to find meaning in all of this." Cornelius narrowed his eyes, as if assessing his son's words. "Meaning? Do you really think there's any meaning in living like this with a woman you barely know and doing work that's beneath you?" Hugo felt a heat rise through his body, an old anger he had been trying to suppress. "It's not about being above or beneath anything, Father. It's about finding something you never taught me, purpose. Maybe you see this as punishment, but here, things have value. People work hard. And what they do has meaning, and I'm learning to appreciate that." Cornelius was silent for a moment, clearly surprised by his son's frankness. It was the first time Hugo had spoken with such conviction about something that didn't involve the luxurious life he had always known. "So that's it?" Cornelius said with a faint, ironic smile. "You think you found your place here as a farmhand? I thought you were more ambitious than that." Hugo felt the weight of his father's words, but this time he didn't waver. "Maybe I was ambitious for the wrong things. Maybe the life you gave me blinded me to what really matters, but now I'm seeing things differently." Cornelius narrowed his eyes, his expression growing harder. "Don't be fooled, Hugo. You're still a Cornelius. No matter how much time you spend here, you'll never be like them." Hugo felt the old wound reopen, the divide between who he was raised to be and who he was starting to become. But he stood firm. "I can be a Cornelius and still find something different, Father. I don't need to be defined by what you made me believe my whole life." The silence between them became heavy, full of unspoken words. Cornelius looked at his son with a mixture of frustration and something else, something that seemed like a small spark of pride, though he would never admit it. "You're changing," Cornelius admitted, his voice low and controlled. "But I'm not sure if that's good or bad." "Maybe you should try seeing beyond what's good or bad," Hugo said, his voice calmer now. "I'm learning to do that." Cornelius remained silent for a long time, his expression serious. There was something profound in that moment, as if the relationship between father and son was finally being laid bare without the pretenses and barriers that had always existed between them. "You're stronger than I thought," Cornelius said at last, his voice soft. "But know that despite everything, I still expect you to come back to the life I've prepared for you." Hugo looked at his father, unsure how to respond. The life Cornelius had prepared for him felt so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. But at the same time, he knew he wasn't entirely ready to let go of that past. "I don't know what my path will be yet," Hugo confessed. "But for the first time, I think I'm starting to figure it out." Cornelius nodded slightly, as if he had understood something in that moment. He glanced at Maria, who had been watching from a distance, and for a moment, it seemed he understood the role she was playing in his son's transformation. "I'll let you continue your journey then," Cornelius said finally, with a hint of resignation. "But remember who you are, Hugo. That will never change." Hugo watched as his father returned to the car and drove away without looking back. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Maria approached slowly, sensing that Hugo needed a moment to process everything. "Are you okay?" she asked in her usual calm tone. Hugo remained silent for a moment, still staring at the horizon. "I think so. Maybe for the first time in a long while." Maria nodded, understanding. She knew that confrontation had been inevitable and that Cornelius' visit had affected Hugo in deep ways. But at the same time, she knew he was changing, finding his own voice and his own way of seeing the world. "And now?" Maria asked with a slight smile. Hugo took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Now, I think I'll keep learning. Maybe this time, I'll do it my way." The sun was already beginning to set on the horizon when Hugo sat on the farmhouse porch, reflecting on his encounter with his father. The silence of the countryside seemed deeper that night, almost as if it were waiting for something. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The conflict with Cornelius had come to an end, but the real battle was just beginning, the internal battle to find his own path. Maria appeared beside him, bringing 2 cups of steaming coffee. She sat down quietly, offering one to Hugo, who accepted with a nod. The silence between them was no longer heavy with tension as it had been in the early days. Now it was a silence of understanding, as if they both knew words were unnecessary. "He'll come back," Hugo finally said, breaking the silence. "My father, he won't give up on bringing me back to the life he planned for me." Maria gave a small smile, bringing the cup to her lips before responding. "Maybe, but I think now more than ever, you know the choice is yours." Hugo nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in her words. He had always believed he was trapped in the destiny his father had laid out for him, but now, after everything he had experienced on the farm, he was starting to realize that freedom was in his own hands. The farm, Maria, and even the hard work had shown him a side of life he had never known, a side that, despite the challenges, brought a peace he had never felt before. "I spent so much time thinking I had to be someone to please my father," Hugo said, looking at the sky, now orange with the setting sun. "But here, I realized I can be someone else, someone I didn't even know existed." Maria watched him in silence, understanding the depth of that confession. She knew Hugo was still in the middle of a great transformation, that this journey would not end easily, but she also knew he was on the right path, and that was what mattered. "You found something here," Maria said softly. "Something you weren't looking for." Hugo smiled faintly, still gazing at the horizon. "Yes, I think I did. I don't know if I'm ready to say goodbye to my old life, but I know I can't go back to being who I was." Maria nodded, understanding Hugo's internal conflict. She had witnessed his journey from the beginning, from the moment he arrived at the farm filled with anger and resentment. Now, the man sitting beside her was someone completely different, calmer, more aware, more willing to face his own demons. "You don't have to decide everything right now," she said gently, placing her hand on his. "Sometimes, the best decision is to wait and let time show us what we need to do." Hugo looked at Maria's hand resting on his, and an unexpected warmth spread through him. It wasn't just the tranquility of the farm or the simplicity of rural life that had transformed him, Maria had been a crucial part of that process. Her quiet strength, her patience, and the way she challenged him without ever pushing too hard, all of it had helped him become the person he was now. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for everything, for not giving up on me." Maria smiled again, a soft and understanding smile. "I never thought about giving up. I guess I knew from the beginning that you just needed time." In the weeks that followed, Hugo continued working on the farm, but now with a new sense of purpose. The work, which once felt like punishment, had become a way to connect with something larger than himself. He began to see the value in each task, in every small accomplishment of the day. Slowly, he gained the respect of the local workers who had once seen him only as the spoiled son of a wealthy businessman. Don Pietro, who had always observed from a distance, noticed the change and commented one morning, "You're doing well, boy. I think you finally found your place." Hugo smiled at the old worker, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "I'm starting to find something. I still don't know if it's my final place, but I'm learning to appreciate what I have here." Pietro let out a short laugh, patting him on the back. "It takes time, but you're on the right path." As the days passed, the connection between Hugo and Maria deepened as well. It was no longer just a matter of living together or being forced into circumstances, they had become partners, sharing not only the farm's work but also their stories, their dreams, and their uncertainties about the future. One evening, as they walked through the fields under the starry sky, Maria looked at Hugo and asked with her usual frankness, "Have you thought about going back to the city?" Hugo was silent for a moment, reflecting on the question. "I have thought about it, yes. But now, the idea of returning to that life doesn't seem as appealing as it used to." Maria smiled slightly, looking up at the sky. "Maybe you don't have to choose between the two things. Maybe there's a way to integrate both parts of you." Hugo looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't have to be a binary choice," Maria explained. "You can continue being the businessman you've always been without losing what you've learned here. Balance is possible if you want it." Those words made Hugo reflect deeply. He had always seen his life as a choice between two extremes, luxury and work, the countryside and the city, his father and Maria. But maybe Maria was right, maybe he could find a way to unite these two parts of himself without having to sacrifice who he truly was. "You're right," he said with a sincere smile. "I think, for the first time, I'm ready to find that balance." Sometime later, Hugo received a call from the city. It was one of his father's lawyers, informing him that Cornelius wanted to meet to discuss the future of the company. Hugo knew this moment would come, but this time he didn't feel the weight of an inevitable decision. He knew that no matter what happened, the life he had found on the farm would never be lost, and with Maria by his side, he was ready to face any challenge. As he prepared for the trip back to the city, Hugo looked at Maria and said, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that wherever I go, I want you by my side." Maria smiled with the serenity he had always admired. "I'll be there." With those words, Hugo left, knowing that no matter what the future brought, he had finally found his true path, and with Maria by his side, he was ready to face anything.